David sat in the courtroom, his grip tightening on the polished wooden table as the heavy doors swung open. And there she was. Emily Carter walked in with the confidence of a woman who had already won. But this time, she wasn't just here to argue over alimony or division of assets. No, she had come armed with something far more dangerous. Her hand rested on her stomach, her movement slow and deliberate, ensuring that every single person in the room saw exactly what she wanted them to see. The soft glow of the courtroom lights cast shadows across her face, amplifying the look of quiet suffering she had perfected over the years. The murmurs started almost instantly. Judges, lawyers, onlookers, every set of eyes flickered between Emily's poised expression and the undeniable curve of her belly. The narrative was shifting, the courtroom tilting in her favor. Before a single word had been spoken, David didn't move, didn't blink. But inside, something coiled tight in his chest. He had prepared for a battle. He hadn't prepared for this. And then Emily spoke, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I have something important to share." She took a breath, placing a protective hand over her stomach, her eyes brimming with calculated emotion. "I'm pregnant, and this child is David's." The room erupted. But she had no idea, absolutely no idea, that her biggest mistake wasn't walking into that courtroom pregnant. It was thinking David Reynolds hadn't already seen this coming. But before we dive into this explosive courtroom showdown, let me know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and if you love these kinds of stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. What do you think will happen next? Let's talk in the comments. David Reynolds had always believed that hard work and perseverance could overcome any obstacle. At 42, he was living proof of that belief. Born and raised in the South Side of Chicago, he had clawed his way out of poverty, built a thriving business in the competitive world of real estate development, and established himself as a respected entrepreneur in a city that often favored old money and insider connections. It hadn't been easy. As a black man in an industry dominated by privilege, he had faced countless doors slammed in his face, investors who subtly but unmistakably doubted his abilities, and clients who hesitated to trust him despite his undeniable results. But he had never backed down. He had worked twice as hard, fought for every opportunity, and proved time and time again that he was just as capable, no, more capable, than the men who had inherited their way to success. It was that drive, that unshakable determination that had first drawn Emily Carter to him. She had been unlike anyone he had ever dated. Elegant, refined, raised in the affluent neighborhoods of the Gold Coast, where wealth wasn't just a measure of success, but a birthright. At first, their differences had fascinated them both. She was intrigued by his ambition, his hunger to succeed, the way he commanded respect in rooms where he had once been underestimated. He, in turn, had been drawn to her confidence, her charm, the effortless way she moved through high society, making connections that had once seemed out of his reach. Their love had been passionate, intoxicating, a whirlwind romance that seemed to defy every expectation. But love, David had learned, was not always enough. Over time, the cracks began to show. Emily had never truly accepted him for who he was. She had admired his success, yes, but she had always wanted to shape him, refine him, mold him into the kind of man who would seamlessly fit into her world. She corrected the way he spoke at dinner parties, pushed him to dress a certain way, and subtly nudged him toward the right kind of business partnerships. At first, David had tolerated it, even humored it, believing she only wanted the best for him. But the more successful he became, the more controlling she grew. When he refused to let her dictate his career choices, when he pushed back against her expectations, the admiration in her eyes began to shift, first to frustration, then to resentment. By the time their marriage fell apart, David wasn't even sure if Emily had ever truly loved him, or if she had simply loved the idea of him, the ambitious, self-made man she could claim as her own success story. But when he finally walked away, she hadn't accepted it. She had turned their divorce into a battleground, a relentless war of legal maneuvers, false accusations, and emotional manipulation. She painted him as the villain, the distant and ungrateful husband who had abandoned his wife when she needed him most. She knew exactly how to play the system, how to weaponize the stereotype that had followed black men for generations. The absentee father, the unreliable partner, the man who couldn't be trusted to honor his commitments. David had prepared himself for a tough fight, but nothing could have truly braced him for the depths Emily was willing to sink to. She filed motions designed to stall the process, dragging out hearings and making baseless claims about financial impropriety. She strategically leaked personal details to mutual friends, spinning a tale of heartbreak and betrayal that painted herself as the helpless victim. At one point, she even convinced one of his biggest investors that David had been reckless with money, nearly costing him a major deal. It wasn't just about winning the divorce. She wanted to ruin him, to make him regret ever walking away from her. But David wasn't the same man he had been when they first met. He had learned to fight smart, to anticipate every move, to stay 3 steps ahead. He had an ironclad prenup, a seasoned lawyer who had seen it all, and most importantly, the truth on his side. He refused to let Emily manipulate him into submission. He knew this battle wasn't just about money or pride. It was about reclaiming his freedom, proving once and for all that he would not be controlled. And yet, even with all his preparation, he never could have expected what Emily would pull next. Because just when he thought the worst was behind him, she walked into the courtroom for their final divorce hearing, her hand resting on her stomach, her eyes filled with practiced vulnerability. Pregnant. And she was about to use it as the ultimate weapon. David sat in the courtroom, his fingers interlocked, his face an unreadable mask of calm. He had spent months preparing for this day, anticipating every move Emily might make, every desperate attempt she would pull to squeeze something out of him before the gavel fell for the final time. But nothing, not even her history of manipulation, had prepared him for what happened next. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and there she was, stepping inside with a slow, deliberate grace that made every head turn. She was glowing. Not the kind of glow that came from happiness, but the kind that came from calculated intention, from knowing every eye in the room was on her. Her hair was styled in soft waves, her makeup was subtle but designed to emphasize her fragility. And then, there was the unmistakable curve of her stomach. David's breath didn't catch, his pulse didn't spike, but deep inside something coiled tight. He knew the moment he saw her, the game had changed. Emily walked like she was floating, her hands cradling her stomach, her expression a mix of sorrow and quiet strength, the perfect balance of vulnerability and resilience. It was a performance, and she played it beautifully. She wasn't just Emily Carter, the soon-to-be ex-wife of David Reynolds. She was Emily Carter, the abandoned, pregnant woman fighting for justice against a cold, heartless man who had left her alone in her time of need, and she knew exactly how it would look. David felt the shift in the room immediately. The judge, an older white man who had been strictly neutral up until now, straightened slightly in his seat, his gaze flicking to Emily with something that almost resembled concern. The bailiff stole a glance, the court clerk whispered something to her colleague, even the opposing lawyer took a breath, as if bracing for what came next. The optics were powerful, a wealthy white woman standing before the court, carrying the child of a successful black man, claiming to have been abandoned. David knew how the world worked, knew that sympathy often favored those who looked the part of the victim, and Emily knew it too. She sat down with a carefully measured sigh, placing a hand against her stomach as if the weight of the world rested there. Her lawyer, young and eager, adjusted his tie, casting a quick glance at her before turning toward the judge, with just the right amount of urgency in his voice. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I want to acknowledge the difficult situation my client is in. She is not just here fighting for a fair divorce settlement, she is here as an expectant mother, left in an impossible position by a man who refuses to take responsibility." David didn't blink, didn't shift in his seat. He had known Emily for years, had seen her lie with a straight face, had watched her weave reality into something unrecognizable. But this was next level. He could already hear the whispers spreading, the silent judgment forming in the minds of the onlookers. This was what she wanted. To paint him into a corner before the proceedings even began. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. The game had changed, but that didn't mean he had lost. Not yet. The silence in the courtroom felt heavier now, thick with an unspoken tension David had known all his life. He had felt it in business meetings when investors looked past him for someone they considered more experienced. He had felt it in country clubs where men shook his hand but never quite met his eyes. And now here it was again, draped over this courtroom like an invisible noose, tightening with every passing second. The judge leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing as he took in Emily's delicate posture, her downcast eyes, the way she absently rested a hand against her stomach as if the weight of it was too much to bear alone. David knew that look. He had seen it before, on teachers who believed the quiet white kid over him in school, on landlords who suddenly lost his rental application after meeting him in person, on police officers who asked him just one too many questions when he parked outside his own office building. It was the look of a man already making up his mind before a single fact had been laid on the table. Emily's lawyer cleared his throat, his voice smooth and practiced but laced with something calculated. Your Honor, my client has endured months of legal battles, endless stress, and now, in the most vulnerable time of her life, she is facing this alone. She is a pregnant woman who has been left without support, without stability, while the man who once vowed to stand by her has moved on without a second thought. He turned slightly, just enough to gesture toward David without looking directly at him, as if even acknowledging him was distasteful. This is not just a divorce case. This is about responsibility. It's about a man who is walking away from a child, from a family, with nothing but financial loopholes and a cold heart to justify it. David exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his knee to keep his composure. He wanted to scoff, wanted to shake his head at the absurdity of it all, but he knew better. Any sign of frustration, any flicker of anger would only confirm what people already wanted to believe, that he was unfeeling, that he was another statistic. The judge, still watching Emily carefully, nodded, his voice softer than it had been in previous hearings. Ms. Carter, I understand this must be incredibly difficult for you. Do you have medical records confirming your pregnancy? Have you received any financial assistance or support from the petitioner since learning of your condition? Emily shifted, her lips trembling slightly as if the very question pained her. Your Honor, I never wanted it to come to this. She took a shaky breath, her voice carefully controlled but breaking just enough to sound genuine. I told David as soon as I found out, and he dismissed me. He acted like I was lying, like I was trying to trap him. I have been alone through all of this. I never thought he could be so cruel. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. David didn't react. He couldn't afford to. Emily dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue, then continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted him to care, to acknowledge that this isn't just about us anymore. There's a baby involved, a life, and I can't do this alone. David's lawyer, Matthew Brooks, finally moved, adjusting his tie with a slow, deliberate motion before standing. Your Honor, while my client understands the gravity of Ms. Carter's claims, we need to establish one critical detail before proceeding any further. He turned his gaze toward Emily's lawyer. Who is the father of this child? The entire room seemed to still. Emily's lawyer hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. David saw it, the judge saw it, the court reporter saw it, and for the first time since walking into the courtroom, Emily's performance faltered, just slightly, her fingers tightening against the armrest of her chair. Her lawyer cleared his throat. My client believes it to be Mr. Reynolds. David almost laughed. Almost. Matthew's expression remained neutral, but his voice was razor-sharp. Believes? So, there's no paternity test? No conclusive proof? Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. The judge, who had moments ago been tilting in Emily's favor, now straightened in his seat, his expression cooling. Ms. Carter, have you had a paternity test? Silence. David leaned back slightly, watching as the performance unraveled, as the carefully curated image of the abandoned, helpless mother cracked at the edges. Emily swallowed hard. I just assumed. The judge's brow lifted, unimpressed. You assumed? Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but before he could salvage the situation, Matthew spoke again. Your Honor, we have substantial evidence suggesting that not only is my client not the father of this child, but that Ms. Carter has been actively involved with another man since their separation. We have photographs, witness statements, and, most importantly, medical records confirming when she first received a positive pregnancy test. Months after my client and Ms. Carter had already been living separately, David watched as Emily's world crumbled in real time. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. The judge exhaled slowly, the last trace of sympathy draining from his face as he glanced toward Emily. "Miss Carter, this court does not take kindly to deception. If the evidence Mr. Reynolds' counsel is presenting is accurate, then your claims for additional financial support have no legal standing." Emily's mouth opened, but nothing came out. David didn't smile, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply sat there, watching as the inevitable caught up with her. She had walked into this courtroom thinking she had already won, but now, for the first time, she looked unsure. And David? He had never been more certain. Matthew Brooks adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable as he let the silence stretch for just a moment longer. The air in the courtroom had shifted. The carefully constructed illusion Emily had wrapped herself in was beginning to unravel. Thread by thread, he tilted his head slightly, voice crisp, deliberate. "Miss Carter, I'll ask again. Who is the father of this child?" Emily's fingers twitched where they rested on the edge of the table. For the first time since she had walked in, her confidence wavered. She inhaled sharply, but the hesitation was damning. Her lawyer cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "My client believes it to be Mr. Reynolds' child, Your Honor." David didn't move, didn't even blink, but inside he almost laughed. Believes? That was all they had? No proof, no certainty, just a flimsy assumption designed to manipulate the court? Matthew exhaled slowly, shaking his head as if he were disappointed. Believes? That's an interesting choice of words. Miss Carter, have you had a paternity test done? Emily's lips parted, but nothing came out. She was good at deception, David would give her that, but even the best liars cracked under pressure. The weight of the room pressed against her, demanding an answer. "I didn't think it was necessary," she finally said, her voice soft, calculated. The judge leaned forward, his fingers interlaced. "Ms. Carter, this is a legal proceeding, not a guessing game. Do you have any medical evidence, any documentation, to support your claim that Mr. Reynolds is the father of this child?" Emily's breath hitched. Her nails dug into the polished wood of the table. "I just assumed, given the timeline—" Matthew cut her off smoothly. "The timeline. Let's discuss that, shall we?" He reached into his folder, pulling out a set of neatly stacked documents, flipping through them with slow precision. "Your Honor, we have medical records obtained through legal subpoena that clearly show Miss Carter's first confirmed pregnancy test was conducted months after she and my client had separated. The math simply doesn't add up." A ripple of murmurs passed through the courtroom. Emily's lawyer shifted, clearly realizing the ground beneath them was crumbling. "With all due respect, Your Honor, pregnancy timelines can be difficult to determine with absolute precision." Matthew didn't even let him finish. "Actually, they're quite precise, especially when documented by a licensed physician. Would you like me to read the date aloud for the court?" He held up the paperwork, tapping a highlighted section with his pen. Emily's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. Her breathing had grown shallower, her grip on the table so tight her knuckles had turned white. The judge exhaled, his earlier sympathy noticeably absent now. "Ms. Carter, unless you can provide definitive proof that the petitioner is the father, we cannot legally entertain any request for financial support related to this pregnancy. This court operates on evidence, not assumptions." David could see it in real time. The moment Emily realized she was losing, her eyes darted toward her lawyer, searching for some way out, some loophole, but there was none. Matthew delivered the final blow effortlessly. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have photographic evidence taken shortly after the separation showing Ms. Carter on an extended vacation with another man. These images depict clear romantic involvement, holding hands, kissing. If we're discussing plausible timelines, that evidence alone suggests Mr. Reynolds is far from the most likely candidate for fatherhood." Emily's lawyer visibly paled. David leaned back slightly, watching as the courtroom absorbed the shift in power. Emily's breath hitched. She looked like she wanted to scream, like she wanted to throw something, like she wanted to claw her way out of the reality she had created for herself. But there was no escape. The judge glanced at her, unimpressed. "Miss Carter, do you have any response?" For the first time in the entire proceeding, she was completely, utterly speechless. Matthew let the silence settle, thick and suffocating. He knew the power of letting someone drown in their own lies, of forcing them to sit with their deception and watch as the world around them pieced together the truth. Emily shifted in her seat, her breathing unsteady, her fingers clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palm. She looked to her lawyer for help, but he was staring at the documents in front of him, already realizing there was no way out of this. Matthew moved with calculated ease, pulling out another stack of papers from his folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence medical records from Ms. Carter's physician, confirming that her first recorded pregnancy test was conducted well after she and my client were no longer together. The conception date doesn't align with any possible interaction between the two." He handed the documents to the bailiff, who walked them to the judge. Emily sat frozen, her lips slightly parted, her face devoid of color. The judge flipped through the papers, his expression darkening with each page. Matthew continued, his tone cool and measured. "In addition, we have recently obtained surveillance footage taken during Ms. Carter's vacation to the Cayman Islands just 2 months after the separation. The footage shows Ms. Carter with another man, engaged in what can only be described as a very intimate interaction, hand-holding, kissing, sharing a hotel suite." He paused, letting the words settle, before pulling another set of documents from his folder. "And if there is any doubt as to the nature of their relationship, we also have financial records showing that the same gentleman made multiple purchases for Ms. Carter, including luxury items and prenatal care expenses." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Emily's entire body stiffened. The perfectly curated image of the abandoned, mistreated woman was crumbling in real time. Matthew delivered the final blow. "And, just in case the timeline wasn't clear enough, Your Honor, we also have text messages subpoenaed from Ms. Carter's phone where she explicitly told a close friend, and I quote, 'If I say it's David's, the court will make him pay.'" The entire room tensed. Emily's lawyer closed his eyes for a long second, clearly realizing he had been defending a sinking ship. David didn't move. He didn't have to. He had already won. The judge exhaled, his demeanor shifting entirely. His earlier concern for Emily was gone, replaced with something closer to disappointment, even irritation. He tapped the papers in front of him, then looked up. "Miss Carter, do you have any explanation for this?" Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. The judge nodded as if that was answer enough. "This court does not take kindly to deliberate deception. Given the evidence, there is no basis for financial support related to this pregnancy, nor does the claim warrant any further discussion. The prenuptial agreement remains in effect, and as such, you are not entitled to alimony or additional compensation." A sharp, strangled noise escaped Emily's throat. David remained still, calm, composed. Emily's hands clenched the edge of the table as if she could physically hold onto the remnants of her collapsing scheme. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had walked in expecting to be the victim, to walk out of here with a guaranteed payday, her reputation intact, her future secured. Instead, she was sitting in the middle of a courtroom being exposed as a liar, a manipulator, a fraud. Her lawyer, sensing the inevitable, leaned in and whispered something to her. Whatever it was, it only made her face tighten further. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "This hearing is over." Emily twitched, as if about to argue, but then she saw the way the judge looked at her, the way her own lawyer had already started gathering his things, and something inside her snapped. The mask slipped, the performance crumbled, and for the first time, the real Emily Carter surfaced. She turned sharply, her voice sharp and rising. "This isn't fair. I'm about to have a baby and he just gets to walk away?" The judge didn't even glance at her. "This court does not make financial rulings based on emotional appeals, Ms. Carter. The law is clear and the evidence is overwhelming. Your request is denied." David finally moved, shifting slightly as he watched Emily come apart. Her breath was ragged, her face twisted with fury. She turned her gaze toward him, desperate for one last shot. "You're really going to do this to me, to your child?" David leaned forward, his voice calm, unshaken. "Do you really want to go on record saying that?" She froze. He tilted his head slightly, voice steady as steel. "Because we can have a court-ordered paternity test done right now." The color drained from her face. The judge stood, adjourned. Emily sat there, motionless, as the gavel struck and reality settled in. Emily's breath came in short, uneven bursts as the reality of the moment crashed down on her. She had walked into this courtroom with a strategy, a perfect plan, a final move she believed would force David into a corner. But now, sitting there, surrounded by the undeniable weight of evidence against her, she was exposed. The mask had slipped. the sympathy she had counted on evaporating before her eyes. The judge was already standing, signaling the end of the hearing, but Emily wasn't ready for it to be over. It couldn't be over. She turned sharply to her lawyer, her fingers gripping his sleeve. "Say something," she hissed under her breath, her voice raw with desperation. But the young attorney had already begun packing his files, his shoulders stiff with embarrassment. He wasn't about to throw himself on the tracks for a case that was now nothing more than a professional humiliation. David watched the scene unfold with the same steady, unshaken composure he had carried throughout the entire trial. He didn't need to say a word. The weight of the truth had done all the talking for him. Emily's fingers curled into fists, her nails dug into her palms as she fought against the rising panic in her chest. "Your Honor, please," she tried again, her voice cracking, her hands trembling as she placed one protectively over her stomach. "I'm carrying a child. Doesn't that count for anything?" The judge let out a slow, tired sigh, clearly done with her performance. "Ms. Carter, this is not a matter of emotion. This is a matter of law, and legally, you have provided no proof that Mr. Reynolds is the father. You have also been caught making misleading statements to this court, which borders dangerously close to perjury. If you continue this line of argument, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter further." Emily's body locked up, the warning hitting her like a slap. For a brief moment, pure fear flashed in her eyes. She had played the system before, twisted truths to her advantage, but now she was standing at the edge of something dangerous. One wrong move, and she wouldn't just be walking out of this courtroom empty-handed. She could be walking into real legal trouble. The room was silent, the weight of her defeat settling over everything. The gavel came down one last time, final and unforgiving. "This hearing is concluded." Emily sat frozen, unable to move, unable to accept the reality that her carefully crafted empire of lies had just collapsed in front of everyone. David had barely stepped out of the courthouse when his phone started buzzing. At first he ignored it, letting the vibrations rattle in his pocket as he walked toward his car. He had expected Emily to try something after the verdict, but he had assumed she would take some time to lick her wounds before launching another attack. He should have known better. By the time he slid into the driver's seat and checked his phone, the damage had already begun. His notifications were flooded, missed calls, unread messages, and emails marked urgent. His assistant had left 3 voicemails, each one more panicked than the last. Social media was on fire. He opened one of the news alerts and felt his stomach tighten. Chicago businessman abandons pregnant ex-wife amid bitter divorce battle. The article featured a carefully selected photo of Emily from the trial, her hand protectively placed over her stomach, her expression soft and sorrowful. The story painted her as a victim, a woman left in the cold by a ruthless man who had built his empire only to discard the woman who had stood by him. There was no mention of the exposed lies, no reference to the evidence proving the baby wasn't his. Nothing about the court ruling in his favor. It was all about her suffering, her struggle, her innocence. David clenched his jaw as he scrolled through the comments. People weren't just believing the story, they were angry. Another man who makes it big and leaves the woman who supported him. Disgusting. While just another statistic, black men never take responsibility. I hope she takes him for everything he's got. It didn't matter that the truth had already been proven in court. It didn't matter that Emily was a fraud, a manipulator who had tried to con the legal system. The world didn't care about evidence. It cared about perception. And right now, the perception was that David was a heartless, abandoning ex-husband who had turned his back on a pregnant woman. His assistant called again. This time he answered. "David," she said, her voice tight with worry. "We have a problem." "I know," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "We lost 3 clients in the last hour," she continued, "and a few more are reevaluating their partnership with us." David exhaled slowly, staring out at the city skyline. He had worked too hard to let one woman's lies destroy him. "Schedule a meeting," he said. "I'll handle it." The next attack came faster than expected. 2 days after the media storm, David received an email from HR. Subject: urgent matter regarding workplace conduct. He skimmed the message, his pulse quickening. A complaint had been filed against him. The details were vague, but the implication was clear. He had been accused of creating an unsafe work environment. David shut his eyes for a long second, then exhaled through his nose. He didn't need to ask who had filed it. Emily had played the legal card, she had played the media card, now she was trying to destroy his career from the inside. The meeting with HR was scheduled for that afternoon. David arrived in his usual composed manner, but he could see it in their eyes the moment he walked in. Hesitation, uncertainty, the unspoken what if lingering in the air. It didn't matter that he had an impeccable track record, that he had built this company from the ground up with integrity. It didn't matter that Emily had already been proven a liar in court. The moment a black man was accused of something, the world started whispering. He sat across from the HR director, a middle-aged man who cleared his throat before speaking. "David, I want you to know this is just a routine inquiry, but given the seriousness of the claim, we have to follow protocol." David leaned back in his chair. "What exactly is she accusing me of?" The director glanced at the file in front of him. Harassment, emotional abuse, creating a toxic and hostile work environment. David almost laughed, almost. Instead, he folded his hands together. "And does she have any evidence?" The director hesitated. "At this time, it seems circumstantial," which meant no evidence, just words, just a story, just the same tired attempt to paint him as the aggressor and herself as the victim. David looked him in the eye. "I've never spoken to Emily in a professional setting. She doesn't work here. She has no connection to this company. And yet, you're treating this as if it's a valid claim." The director shifted uncomfortably. "Like I said, we have to follow protocol." David exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. "Then do your investigation. Talk to my employees, review my records, and when you're done, I expect an official statement clearing my name." 2 days later, the verdict was in. The complaint was baseless. There was no evidence, no corroboration, nothing to support Emily's claims. HR closed the case. But the damage had already been done. The whispers had already started. The stain of an accusation, even a false one, never fully faded, and Emily knew that. David was reviewing a contract in his office when his phone chimed with a new email. At first, he ignored it, but something about the subject line caught his attention. "Final notice. Outstanding loan agreement." His eyes narrowed as he clicked it open. The message was from an unfamiliar email address, but the moment he saw the name at the bottom, he knew exactly who had sent it. Emily Carter. His jaw tightened as he read the first few lines. It was a formal demand letter, claiming that David had borrowed $250,000 from her during their marriage and had failed to fulfill the repayment terms. The attached document was a forged loan agreement, complete with what appeared to be his signature at the bottom. David exhaled slowly, forcing down the initial wave of anger rising in his chest. Emily wasn't just desperate now, she was reckless. He scrolled down and saw the real dagger at the end of the email. "Pay me or I take this to court." There it was, the blackmail, the threat. The final pathetic attempt to squeeze money out of him after every other plan had failed. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. He could have replied, called her bluff, told her outright that she had just committed a felony, but he knew Emily too well. She didn't think this was a risk. She thought this was her last chance to win. Instead, he forwarded the email to Matthew. Subject, "Let's end this." His lawyer called within minutes, his voice edged with something close to amusement. "She's really lost it this time." David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "She thinks I'll panic, that I'll settle just to shut her up." Matthew chuckled. "Well, let's show her what happens when you bet against the house." 2 days later, Emily received her own legal notice, only this one wasn't a demand for money. It was a formal lawsuit against her for fraud, extortion. David wasn't just playing defense anymore, he was taking her to court. The moment the papers were served, Emily's world imploded. She hadn't expected David to push back this hard. She had assumed he would try to quietly make this disappear, afraid of the bad press, afraid of what another scandal might do to his reputation. She had counted on his fear, not his anger. But David wasn't afraid. He was done. The lawsuit laid everything bare. Her forged documents, her blackmail attempt, her history of manipulating the legal system. It wasn't just a counterattack. It was a complete obliteration of every ounce of credibility she had left. Emily scrambled, trying to find a lawyer willing to take her case, but no one wanted to go to war over provable fraud. The court had already ruled against her once. Now she was facing actual criminal consequences. When the judge reviewed the evidence, he didn't just throw out her fake loan claim, he referred the case for further investigation into potential perjury and financial fraud. Emily had spent months trying to destroy David. In the end, she had destroyed herself. David was sipping his morning coffee when his phone buzzed with an incoming call from Matthew. He answered immediately, already bracing himself for whatever disaster Emily had conjured up this time. Matthew didn't waste any time. She filed a restraining order against you. David set his cup down slowly, his expression unreadable. On what grounds? Matthew sighed. Same playbook. Claims you've been harassing her, sending threatening messages, following her, making her feel unsafe. She's asking for immediate protection. David let out a humorless laugh. She's really going for broke, huh? She's desperate, Matthew said. And it's a problem because the courts tend to err on the side of caution in cases like this. If she gets a temporary order, even if we overturn it later, it could hurt your reputation. We need to shut this down fast. David leaned back, rolling his shoulders. He had seen Emily manipulate people before, had watched her turn lies into carefully curated tragedies. But this was something else. Do we have enough to prove she's lying? Matthew chuckled. Oh, we have more than enough. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. David walked into the courtroom with his usual calm, but he could feel the weight of Emily's performance before she even spoke. She sat at her table, looking fragile, her hair pulled back, her makeup minimal, her hands trembling just enough to seem convincing. Her lawyer stood, voice solemn. Your Honor, my client has endured months of relentless harassment from Mr. Reynolds. She fears for her safety. The emotional toll has been unbearable, especially given her condition. He gestured toward Emily, who let out a shaky breath, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. David didn't react. He had learned that silence was more powerful than outrage. The judge turned to Matthew. Mr. Brooks, how does your client respond? Matthew stood, adjusting his cufflinks with slow precision. Your Honor, before we get into the details of Ms. Carter's allegations, I'd like to present some very important evidence. He walked to the judge's bench, placing a neatly organized stack of documents down with a crisp finality. These are call logs, text message records, and emails that clearly show my client has had no contact with Ms. Carter since the divorce was finalized. In fact, as you'll see, the only person initiating contact has been her. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The judge flipped through the records, his frown deepening. Ms. Carter, he said slowly, lifting his gaze. According to these records, you have sent over 40 messages to Mr. Reynolds in the last 2 months. He has not responded to a single one. Emily's face drained of color. Matthew continued mercilessly. Furthermore, we have records of Ms. Carter contacting mutual acquaintances, spreading false rumors about my client. There is not a single piece of evidence that supports her claim of harassment. In fact, the evidence suggests quite the opposite. The judge turned to Emily's lawyer, his patience wearing thin. Do you have anything to substantiate your client's claims? The young attorney swallowed hard, shifting awkwardly. Your Honor, my client feels threatened. The fear she has experienced. The judge held up a hand. This court does not operate on feelings. It operates on facts. His tone turned sharper as he fixed his gaze on Emily. Ms. Carter, do you understand the severity of filing a false restraining order? Emily's jaw was tight, her entire body tense, but she remained silent. The judge sighed, shaking his head. Request denied. This hearing is over. David exhaled slowly as Emily sat frozen in her chair, her latest scheme publicly dismantled. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out, never once looking back. Emily sat frozen as the judge's words echoed through the courtroom. Request denied. The finality of it settled over her like a suffocating weight, pressing down until she couldn't contain it anymore. Her hands curled into fists, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to win. She was supposed to leave David drowning in legal troubles, his reputation shattered, his career destroyed. Instead, she was the one crumbling. Her body trembled with rage as David calmly stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and turned to leave as if she were nothing more than an afterthought. That was the last straw. You think this is over? She shrieked, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. Heads turned. The quiet murmur of the courtroom came to a standstill. You think you've won? David paused but didn't look at her. He didn't need to. She had already lost. Emily shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. "You're a monster. You abandoned me. You humiliated me in front of everyone, and you just get to walk away?" Her voice cracked, raw and unhinged. The judge sighed heavily, already motioning to the bailiff, but Emily wasn't done. She turned, her wild eyes locking onto the one person she was sure would back her up. "David's mother, Linda Reynolds." Emily's voice wavered, desperate now. "Linda, you can't seriously be okay with this. I was your daughter-in-law for years. You know what he's like, how cold he can be. He left me with nothing, and now I have a baby on the way. Is this really the kind of son you raised?" Linda stood slowly, folding her arms across her chest. For a moment there was a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. Then she exhaled, shaking her head. "No, Annalie," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't about the son I raised. This is about the woman you really are." Emily flinched. "What?" "I defended you once," Linda continued, her voice unwavering. "I believed you when you cried to me, when you told me you were the victim, but I see it now. You don't want justice. You don't want fairness. You just want to hurt him." Emily's lips trembled, but no words came out. Linda took a step forward, her eyes locking onto Emily's with quiet finality. "You had us all fooled once, never again." The words landed like a slap. Emily staggered back, shaking her head in disbelief. No, you don't understand. He manipulated you. He's making me look crazy." Security stepped forward, their presence looming over her. One of the officers placed a firm hand on her arm. "Ms. Carter, you need to leave." Emily jerked away, her voice rising to a near scream. "I hope you rot, David. I hope you lose everything." But David didn't react. He didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. He simply turned and walked away as security dragged her out of the courtroom, kicking and screaming. And just like that, Emily Carter had truly lost everything. David was in his office when his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and saw Matthew's name flashing across the screen. Something in his gut told him this wasn't just a routine call. He picked up, keeping his tone even. "Tell me it's good news." Matthew let out a low chuckle. "Oh, it's better than good. Emily's been arrested." David blinked, gripping the phone a little tighter. "Arrested? For what?" "She finally went too far," Matthew said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Check fraud, identity theft. Turns out, after she burned every bridge trying to take you down, she got desperate. She started forging checks and using stolen credit card information to keep herself afloat. One of her victims pressed charges, and now she's facing actual prison time." David exhaled slowly, letting the words sink in. He had always known Emily would self-destruct eventually, but even he hadn't expected it to happen this fast. "How bad is it?" Matthew clicked his tongue. "Bad. They've got hard evidence, security footage, bank records, fraudulent signatures. This isn't a slap on the wrist situation, we're talking felony charges." David leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline outside his window. He wasn't surprised, not really. Emily had spent years lying, manipulating, twisting reality to fit whatever story benefited her most. But there were rules to the game, and she had always relied on the assumption that she could outmaneuver the consequences. This time, she had backed herself into a corner with no way out. "So what happens now?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Matthew sighed. "She'll be arraigned soon. If convicted, she's looking at real time behind bars. No more legal games, no more media stunts, just a cell and a long list of regrets." David didn't feel joy, didn't feel triumph. There was no victory in watching someone destroy themselves. But there was closure. Emily had spent months, years even, trying to tear him down, to ruin everything he had built, and in the end, she had only ruined herself. Matthew's voice softened slightly. "I know this has been a long road, David, but it's over now. She can't touch you anymore." David let out a slow breath, the weight of years of battles finally lifting off his shoulders. "Yeah," he murmured, nodding to himself. "It's over." David ended the call and set his phone down on his desk. He stared out the window at the Chicago skyline. The city that had once felt like a battlefield now seemed different, quieter, lighter, almost peaceful. He inhaled deeply, letting the moment settle in. For the first time in years, there was no impending fight, no looming legal threat, no games to anticipate. Emily was gone, not just from his life, but from the power she once held over it. He had imagined this moment so many times, picturing how he would feel when it was finally over. He had thought maybe there would be satisfaction, some sense of victory, but now that it was here, all he felt was relief. No triumph, no need to gloat, just a deep, quiet exhale of a burden finally lifted. He thought about the years he had spent trying to protect himself from Emily's endless schemes, the way she had embedded herself in every aspect of his life, always lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Now, there was nothing left for her to take, nothing left for her to twist into another attack. He wasn't naive. Emily would probably try to claw her way out of this, blame the system, blame him, blame anyone but herself. But it didn't matter. She was no longer his problem. His assistant knocked lightly on the door and peeked in. "Everything okay?" David turned to her and gave a small, genuine smile. Something he hadn't done in a long time. "Yeah," he said, standing up and stretching his shoulders. "For the first time in a while, everything's just fine." He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the door, not because he was running from anything, but because for the first time he was moving forward without looking over his shoulder. Emily sat alone in a dingy motel room, the cheap overhead light flickering as she stared blankly at the wall. Her entire world had collapsed in a matter of months, and no matter how many times she tried to piece together a way out, there was none. Her bank accounts were drained, her credit destroyed, and every door she had once walked through so effortlessly was now slammed shut. She had spent years crafting an image of wealth, status, and influence, but now all she had left was the cold reality of who she truly was: a fraud. Her family had finally cut ties. At first, they had believed her sob story, even offering to help her after the divorce. But once her fraud case made headlines, once her name became synonymous with criminal deception, the calls stopped. Her father, a man who had always bailed her out of trouble, had given her a final, disgusted sigh before telling her she was on her own now. Her mother wouldn't even pick up the phone. Her ex-boyfriend Mark had been the last lifeline she had hoped to cling to, but after seeing the extent of her lies, he had walked away too. She had pleaded with him, cried, begged, swearing she had only done what she had to do, but he wasn't interested in excuses. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Emily. I don't think I ever did." That was the last thing he said before leaving her standing on the sidewalk, broken and humiliated. She had tried to apply for government assistance, hoping to at least secure some kind of financial relief, but even that had been denied. The system required proof of income, proof of hardship, and most damning of all, proof of honesty. Her fraud case had flagged her in every database. No one was willing to help a woman who had lied her way through life and finally gotten caught. Emily clenched her jaw, her hands shaking as she stared at her phone. There was only one person left to blame. She pulled up David's number, the only number she had memorized by heart, the one she had told herself she would never call again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before she finally typed out the message. "Are you happy now?" She pressed send, her chest tightening as she waited for a response. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to manipulate him, to make him feel guilty, to make him care. Her phone vibrated seconds later. "You did this to yourself." No sympathy, no hesitation, just the cold, hard truth. Before she could type a reply, a notification flashed at the top of the screen. "David Reynolds has blocked you. Forever." David sat in his office, watching as his assistant placed a new stack of signed contracts on his desk. Business was booming again. The damage Emily had tried to inflict, the false media stories, the corporate whispers, the quiet doubts from longtime clients, had all crumbled under the weight of the truth. The moment her fraud case became public, the narrative flipped. Those who had distanced themselves from him suddenly came crawling back, offering apologies, excuses, and desperate attempts to salvage their working relationships. Some he accepted back, others he didn't. He had earned the right to be selective. The media, once eager to paint him as the cold, unfeeling man who abandoned a pregnant woman, had gone silent when Emily's crimes came to light. Not a single retraction, no public apologies from the journalists who had twisted the story in her favor. But the people who mattered, his business partners, his real friends, his employees, they knew the truth. That was enough. One day, a reporter reached out, offering him a chance to set the record straight. He almost declined. He had no interest in rehashing the past, no desire to give Emily even a second of his time in the public eye. But then he thought about how many men had been in his position before, accused, judged, and convicted by public opinion before they ever had a chance to speak. So he spoke. He shared his story not as a way to seek revenge, but as a way to show others how easily a lie can ruin a man's life. He didn't frame himself as a victim. He wasn't one. He had won. He had fought back, stood his ground, and refused to let someone else's deception define him. Messages started pouring in. Some were from men who had gone through the same thing, others from people who had once believed Emily but now saw how deep her lies had run. And for the first time, David realized that his story wasn't just his own anymore. It was a warning, a lesson, a reminder that the truth always has a way of fighting back. Sitting in his office, looking out over the city he had built his success in, he finally understood. Real victory wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about watching Emily fall. It was about moving forward. And he was doing just that. David hadn't thought about Emily in weeks. Life had moved forward, his business was thriving, and the weight she had once placed on his shoulders was gone. But fate had a way of bringing unfinished chapters back to the surface, even when you thought you had closed the book for good. It happened on a quiet afternoon. He had stepped into a small cafe off Michigan Avenue, a place he rarely visited but had wandered into on impulse. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans and something freshly baked. He ordered his drink and waited by the counter, scrolling through emails, when something in the corner of his vision made him pause. There, tucked away in the farthest booth near the window, was Emily. For a brief second, he almost didn't recognize her. She looked small, not the woman who had once strutted into courtrooms with confidence, not the Emily who had played the victim so flawlessly, twisting every situation to her advantage. The woman sitting in that cafe was a shadow of who she had once been. Her clothes, once designer and carefully curated, were now wrinkled and plain. Her hair, once styled to perfection, hung lifelessly around her face. The dark circles under her eyes told a story of sleepless nights and stress that had finally caught up to her. She was alone. No carefully chosen audience, no lawyer to argue her case, no cameras waiting to capture her next move. Just her, hunched over a nearly empty coffee cup, staring out the window like she had nowhere else to be. David felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, no pity. For a moment, as if sensing him, she turned her head. Their eyes met. A flicker of something passed through her gaze, recognition, resentment, maybe even regret, but David didn't linger on it. He didn't nod, didn't acknowledge her with words. He simply gave her a small, effortless smile, not cruel, not mocking, just a quiet confirmation of what they both already knew. She had lost, and then, just like that, he turned and walked away. She had been a storm in his life for years, tearing through everything in her path, leaving destruction in her wake. But now, she was nothing more than a passing cloud, faded and drifting further from his world. As he stepped outside, breathing in the crisp afternoon air, he felt true, undeniable freedom. David didn't look back as he stepped out of the cafe, but the question lingered in his mind for only a second before he let it go. He had given Emily chance after chance, ignored every warning, believed in the better version of her that never existed. He had nothing left to give, not sympathy, not forgiveness, not even anger. He had moved on, and that was the greatest victory of all. But what about you? If you were in David's shoes, if the person who had spent years manipulating, lying, and trying to destroy you was now sitting alone, broken and defeated, would you have helped them? Would you have reached out one last time? Or would you have walked away like David did, knowing that some people only learn through consequences? There are those who might say he should have shown mercy, that walking away without a word was too cold, too final, that maybe Emily deserved a moment of grace. But then again, what had she ever done to deserve it? Had she shown mercy when she tried to destroy his business? When she tried to ruin his reputation? When she forged documents, blackmailed him, and weaponized the legal system against him? At what point do we stop feeling responsible for the people who wouldn't hesitate to burn us down if it meant saving themselves? And what about those who have been through something similar? Have you ever had someone in your life who refused to take accountability, who twisted reality, who played the victim, even when they were the cause of their own downfall? How did you handle it? Did you fight back, or did you let them self-destruct on their own? Maybe the real question isn't whether Emily deserved what happened to her. Maybe the real question is, when is it okay to stop saving someone from themselves? Drop your thoughts in the comments, let's talk. David had spent years fighting battles he never should have had to fight, defending himself against lies, manipulation, and a system that too often sided with the loudest victim, not the real one. But in the end, he had realized something powerful. He never had to destroy Emily. She did that all on her own. Some people will go to war trying to bring you down, not because you deserve it, but because they can't handle watching you rise. They will twist the truth, create false narratives, and push every button they can, hoping to get a reaction. But the truth is, you don't have to fight every battle. You don't have to prove yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes the greatest victory is refusing to play their game. David could have let his anger consume him. He could have let bitterness take over, could have spent years trying to make Emily suffer the way she had tried to make him suffer. But that would have meant carrying her weight, her toxicity, her chaos, long after she was gone. And he refused to do that. Because real power isn't in fighting back, it's in walking away. There will always be people who try to define you, who want to control your story, who want to reduce you to the version of you that serves their narrative. Don't let them. Stand your ground. Know who you are. Protect your reputation, your peace, and your future, and when the time comes, move forward without looking back. David didn't need revenge. He didn't need to see Emily suffer. He just needed his life back. And when he finally got it, he realized that was the only victory that ever truly mattered. Some people will destroy themselves trying to ruin you. The real power isn't in fighting back, it's in letting them fall on their own. Never let anyone define your story. Stand your ground, stay smart, and keep moving forward. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that keep you thinking.